So in order for a muscle to contract, it first must be signaled to contract. But which organ systems were responsible for signaling in the body? So back in chapter 1, we learned of 2 organ systems that had the responsibility of sending signals and communicating within the body. We had the nervous system, which was very rapid at signaling, very direct at signaling, but its effects were not very long lasting. So that is, when the neuron was no longer stimulated, this means that signaling would stop as soon as the neuron was no longer stimulated. And on the other hand, we had the endocrine system, which used a series of endocrine glands that released hormones into the blood. This system was slow to begin signaling, but its effects were much more long-lasting than the nervous system. So we actually find that it is the nervous system's primary responsibility of signaling and controlling the muscle cells. Now, of course, it has other responsibilities within the body as well, but as far as the muscular system is concerned, the nervous system has the primary responsibility of signaling things like muscles. So the neurons that signal skeletal muscles are typically referred to as somatic motor neurons. This word somatic means body, and so these are the motor or muscle neurons that serve the body muscles. And when we say somatic, we're specifically referring to the skeletal muscles. So for the most part, the somas, or the cell bodies of these somatic motor neurons, are housed within the spinal cord. Now, the muscles, the skeletal muscles that are in the head and the neck, have somatic motor neurons that are housed in the brain, and those motor neurons then communicate with the muscles in the head and the neck. But the muscles that are below the neck are served by somatic motor neurons that are found in the spinal cord and emerge from the spinal cord. So the somatic motor neurons bridge the gap between the spinal cord and the muscle with these very long axons. And so the somatic motor neurons connect to the skeletal muscles with these single long axons. And these axons typically are branched at the ends of the axons, so that means that one motor neuron can signal many dozens or even hundreds of skeletal muscle fibers. So just to give you an idea of what that looks like, here's kind of a simplified diagram of a cross-section of the spinal cord with its somatic motor neurons that are embedded. The somas, or the bodies of those neurons, are embedded deep within the spinal cord, and these long axons that emerge from the spinal cord and make connections with our skeletal muscle cells here. So each of these rod-like structures that you're seeing here is a single skeletal muscle fiber or cell. And so the neuron somas are housed in the spinal cord here, and the axons that meet these skeletal muscle cells can sometimes be really long. So depending on where the skeletal muscle is located with respect to the spinal cord, sometimes this axon can be upwards of 2 to 3 feet long. So these neurons that reach these skeletal muscle cells can often be very long in terms of their axon length. And what we see when that axon makes a connection to a skeletal muscle cell is that we see a junction between a specialized junction between the neuron and the skeletal muscle cell. And this is typically referred to as the neuromuscular junction, or it's also called the motor end plate as well. So whichever term you use there is anatomically correct. So if you see both of those terms, just know that they're referring to the same thing here. So when the somatic motor neuron is stimulated, that stimulus creates an electrical signal, or can create an electrical signal, called an action potential. And this action potential runs or spreads down the length of the axon very rapidly, and that axon, or that action potential, upon its arrival at the ends of the axon here, will cause the release of a chemical called neurotransmitter. And ultimately it's this neurotransmitter that has the job of signaling the skeletal muscle cell. So let's take a look at how that works, or let's take a closer look at the anatomy at the neuromuscular junction. So the end of the axon at the neuromuscular junction tends to be expanded. That is, it's kind of this bulb-like region here. And this is typically referred to as the axon terminal. And this axon terminal comes in very close proximity, but it never actually touches the sarcolemma. So recall that the sarcolemma is the term that we use for the plasma membrane of our skeletal muscle cell. So inside of the axon terminal, which is what we're seeing here in this little cutaway diagram here, is that we see that there are small vesicles called synaptic vesicles. Now, these vesicles in particular contain that neurotransmitter substance, and that neurotransmitter will be released from the neuron when the neuron is stimulated. So this neurotransmitter then travels across this small fluid-filled gap here between the neuron and our skeletal muscle cell here, and will stimulate the skeletal muscle cell to contract. So this neurotransmitter that specifically stimulates skeletal muscle cells is called acetylcholine, which is typically abbreviated ACH. So this was actually the first neurotransmitter that was ever discovered because it's really easy to study the junction between a neuron and a skeletal muscle cell because they're fairly superficial within the body, or they can be fairly superficial within the body. So this was actually the first neurotransmitter to be described by modern science. So as I mentioned previously, there is a very small fluid-filled gap between this expanded axon terminal here and the sarcolemma, or the plasma membrane of our skeletal muscle cell. And this fluid-filled gap is typically referred to as the synaptic cleft. Now, the sarcolemma at the synaptic cleft has a number of receptors for acetylcholine. So it's got numerous acetylcholine receptors, which you're seeing in these little purple channel-like looking structures here. So you'll also see here that away from the neuromuscular junction, the sarcolemma is relatively flat and unfolded. At the sarcolemma at the neuromuscular junction is typically highly folded, and this is usually referred to as the junctional folds, which helps increase the surface area of the sarcolemma here at the neuromuscular junction. And it basically allows for more neurotransmitter receptors to be located at that neuromuscular junction there.